Chapter 2. Written in the Rocks. The crust of the earth is a vast museum, but the natural collections have been made only at intervals of time immensely remote. Charles Darwin, On the Origin of Species. The story of life on Earth is written in the rocks. True, this is a history book, torn and twisted, with remnants of pages scattered about. But it is there, and significant portions are still legible. Paleontologists have worked tirelessly to piece together the tangible historical evidence for evolution, the fossil record. When we admire breathtaking fossils, such as the great dinosaur skeletons that grace our natural history museums, it is easy to forget just how much effort has gone into discovering, extracting, preparing, and describing them. Time-consuming, expensive, and risky expeditions to remote and inhospitable corners of the world are often involved. My University of Chicago colleague, Paul Serino, for instance, studies African dinosaurs, and many of the most interesting fossils lie smack in the middle of the Sahara Desert. He and his colleagues have braved political troubles, bandits, disease, and of course the rigors of the desert itself to discover remarkable new species such as Afrovenator abacensis and Jobaria tiguidensis, specimens that have helped rewrite the story of dinosaur evolution. Such discoveries involve true dedication to science, many years of painstaking work, persistence, and courage, as well as a healthy dose of luck. But many paleontologists would risk their lives for finds like these. To biologists, fossils are as valuable as gold dust. Without them, we'd have only a sketchy outline of evolution. All we could do would be to study living species and try to infer evolutionary relationships through similarities in form, development, and DNA sequence. We would know, for example, that mammals are more closely related to reptiles than to amphibians, but we wouldn't know what their common ancestors looked like. We'd have no inkling of giant dinosaurs, some as large as trucks, or of our early Australopithecine ancestors, small-brained but walking erect. Much of what we'd like to know about evolution would remain a mystery. Fortunately, advances in physics, geology, and biochemistry, along with the daring and persistence of scientists throughout the world, have provided these precious insights into the past. Making the record. Fossils have been known since ancient times. Aristotle discussed them, and fossils of the beaked dinosaur Protoceratops may have given rise to the mythological griffin of the ancient Greeks. But the real meaning of fossils wasn't appreciated until much later. Even in the 19th century, they were simply explained away as products of supernatural forces, organisms buried in Noah's flood, or remains of still-living species inhabiting remote and uncharted parts of the globe. But within these petrified remains lies the history of life. How can we decipher that history? First, of course, you need the fossils, lots of them. Then you have to put them in the proper order from oldest to youngest, and then you must find out exactly when they were formed. Each of these requirements comes with its own set of challenges. The formation of fossils is straightforward, but requires a very specific set of circumstances. First, the remains of an animal or plant must find their way into water, sink to the bottom, and get quickly covered by sediment, so that they don't decay or get scattered by scavengers. Only rarely do dead plants and land-dwelling creatures find themselves on the bottom of a lake or ocean. This is why most of the fossils we have are of marine organisms, which live on or in the ocean floor, or naturally sink to the floor when they die. Once buried safely in the sediments, the hard parts of fossils become infiltrated or replaced by dissolved minerals. What remains is a cast of a living creature that becomes compressed into rock by the pressure of sediments piling up on top. Because soft parts of plants and animals aren't easily fossilized, this immediately creates a severe bias in what we can know about ancient species. Bones and teeth are abundant, as are shells and the hard outer skeletons of insects and crustaceans. But worms, jellyfish, bacteria, and fragile creatures like birds are much rarer, as are all terrestrial species compared to aquatic ones. Over the first 80% of the history of life, all species were soft-bodied, so we have only a foggy window into the earliest and most interesting developments in evolution, and none at all into the origin of life. Once a fossil is formed, it has to survive the endless shifting, folding, heating, and crushing of the Earth's crust, processes that completely obliterate most fossils. Then it must be discovered. Buried deeply beneath the Earth's surface, most are inaccessible to us. Only when the sediments are raised and exposed by the erosion of wind or rain can they be attacked with the paleontologist's hammer. And there is only a short window of time before these semi-exposed fossils are themselves effaced by wind, water, and weather. Taking into account all of these requirements, it's clear that the fossil record must be incomplete. How incomplete? The total number of species that ever lived on Earth has been estimated to range between 17 million, probably a drastic underestimate given that at least 10 million species are alive today, and 4 billion. Since we have discovered around 250,000 different fossil species, we can estimate that we have fossil evidence of only 0.1% to 1% of all species, hardly a good sample of the history of life. Many amazing creatures must have existed that are forever lost to us. Nevertheless, we have enough fossils to give us a good idea of how evolution proceeded, and to discern how major groups split off from one another. Ironically, the fossil record was originally put in order not by evolutionists, but by geologists who were also creationists, and who accepted the account of life given in the book of Genesis. These early geologists simply ordered the different layers of rocks that they found, often from canal excavations that accompanied the industrialization of England, using principles based on common sense. Because fossils occur in sedimentary rocks that begin as silt in oceans, rivers, or lakes, or more rarely as sand dunes or glacial deposits, the deeper layers, or strata, must have been laid down before the shallower ones. Younger rocks lie atop older ones, but not all layers are laid down at any one place. Sometimes there's no water to form sediments. To establish a complete ordering of rock layers, then, you must cross-correlate the strata from different localities around the world. If a layer of the same type of rock, containing the same type of fossils, appears in two different places, it's reasonable to assume that the layer is of the same age in both places. So, for example, if you find 4 layers of rock in one location, let's label them from shallowest to deepest as A, B, D, E, and then you find just 2 of those same layers in another place, interspersed with yet another layer, B, C, D, you can infer that this record includes at least 5 layers of rock in the order from youngest to oldest of A, B, C, D, E. This principle of superposition was first devised in the 17th century by the Danish polymath Nicolaus Steno, who later became an archbishop and was canonized by Pope Pius XI in 1988. Surely the only case of a saint making an important scientific contribution. Using Steno's principle, the geological record was painstakingly ordered in the 18th and 19th centuries, all the way from the very old Cambrian to the recent. So far, so good. But this tells you only the relative ages of rocks, not their actual ages. Since about 1945, we have been able to measure the actual ages of some rocks using radioactivity. Certain radioactive elements, radioisotopes, are incorporated into igneous rocks when they crystallize out of molten rock from beneath the Earth's surface. Radioisotopes gradually decay into other elements at a constant rate, usually expressed as the half-life, the time required for half of the isotope to disappear. If we know the half-life, how much of the radioisotope was there when the rock formed, something that geologists can accurately determine, and how much remains now, it's relatively simple to estimate the age of the rock. Different isotopes decay at different rates. Old rocks are often dated using uranium-238, U-238, found in the common mineral zircon. U-238 has a half-life of around 700 million years. Carbon-14, with a half-life of 5,730 years, is used for much younger rocks, or even human artifacts such as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Several radioisotopes usually occur together, so the dates can be cross-checked, and the ages invariably agree. The rocks that bear fossils, however, are not igneous but sedimentary, and can't be dated directly. But we can obtain the ages of fossils by bracketing the sedimentary layers with the dates of adjacent igneous layers that contain radioisotopes. Opponents of evolution often attack the reliability of these dates by saying that rates of radioactive decay might have changed over time or with the physical stresses experienced by rocks. This objection is often raised by young Earth creationists, who hold the Earth to be 6,000 to 10,000 years old. But it is specious. Since the different radioisotopes in a rock decay in different ways, they wouldn't give consistent dates if decay rates changed. Moreover, the half-lives of isotopes don't change when scientists subject them to extreme temperatures and pressures in the laboratory. And when radiometric dates can be checked against dates from the historical record, as with the carbon-14 method, they invariably agree. It is radiometric dating of meteorites that tells us that the Earth and Solar System are 4.6 billion years old. The oldest Earth rocks are a bit younger, 4.3 billion years in samples from northern Canada, because older rocks have been destroyed by movements of the Earth's crust. There are yet other ways to check the accuracy of radiometric dating. One of them uses biology, and involved an ingenious study of fossil corals by John Wells of Cornell University. Radioisotope dating showed that these corals lived during the Devonian period, about 380 million years ago. But Wells could also find out when these corals lived simply by looking closely at them. He made use of the fact that the friction produced by tides gradually slows the Earth's rotation over time. Each day, one revolution of the Earth is a tiny bit longer than the last one. Not that you would notice. To be precise, the length of a day increases by about 2 seconds every 100,000 years. Since the duration of a year, the time it takes the Earth to circle the Sun, doesn't change over time, this means that the number of days per year must be decreasing over time. From the known rate of slowing, Wells calculated that when his corals were alive, 380 million years ago, if the radiometric dating was correct, each year would have contained about 396 days, each 22 hours long. If there was some way that the fossils themselves could tell how long each day was when they were alive, we could check whether that length matched up with the 22 hours predicted from radiometric dating. But corals can do this, for as they grow, they record in their bodies how many days they experience each year. Living corals produce both daily and annual growth rings. In fossil specimens, we can see how many daily rings separate each annual one. That is, how many days were included in each year when that coral was alive. Knowing the rate of tidal slowing, we can also cross-check the tidal age against the radiometric age. Counting rings in his Devonian corals, Wells found that they experienced about 400 days per year, which means that each day was 21.9 hours long. That's only a tiny deviation from the predicted 22 hours. This clever biological calibration gives us additional confidence in the accuracy of radiometric dating. The facts. What would constitute evidence for evolution in the fossil record? There are several types. First, the big evolutionary picture, a scan through the entire sequence of rock strata, should show early life to be quite simple, with more complex species appearing only after some time. Moreover, the youngest fossils we find should be those that are most similar to living species. We should also be able to see cases of evolutionary change within lineages. That is, one species of animal or plant changing into something different over time. Later species should have traits that make them look like the descendants of earlier ones. And since the history of life involves the splitting of species from common ancestors, we should be able to see this splitting and find evidence of those ancestors in the fossil record. For example, 19th-century anatomists predicted that, from their bodily similarities, mammals evolved from ancient reptiles. So we should be able to find fossils of reptiles that were becoming more mammal-like. Of course, because the fossil record is incomplete, we can't expect to document every transition between major forms of life, but we should find at least some. When writing The Origin, Darwin bemoaned the sketchy fossil record. At that time, we lacked transitional series of fossils or missing links between major forms that could document evolutionary change. Some groups, like whales, appeared suddenly in the record without known ancestors. But Darwin still had some fossil evidence for evolution. This included the observation that ancient animals and plants were very different from living species, resembling modern species more and more as one moved up to more recently formed rocks. He also noted that fossils in adjacent layers were more similar to each other than to those found in layers more widely separated, implying a gradual and continuous process of divergence. What's more, at any given place, the fossils in the most recently deposited rocks tended to resemble the modern species living in that area, rather than the species living in other parts of the world. Fossil marsupials, for instance, were found in profusion only in Australia, and that's where most modern marsupials live. This suggested that modern species descended from the fossil ones. Those fossil marsupials include some of the most bizarre mammals that ever lived, including a giant 10-foot kangaroo with a flat face, huge claws, and a single toe on each foot. What Darwin didn't have were enough fossils to show clear evidence of gradual changes within species or of common ancestors. But since his time, paleontologists have turned up fossils galore, fulfilling all the predictions mentioned above. We can now show continuous changes within lineages of animals. We have lots of evidence for common ancestors and transitional forms. Those missing ancestors of whales, for instance, have turned up. And we have dug deep enough to see the very beginnings of complex life. Big patterns. Now that we have put all the strata in order and estimated their dates, we can read the fossil record from bottom to top. Note, see Figure 3. Figure 3 shows a simplified timeline of life's history, depicting the major biological and geological events that occurred since the first organisms arose around 3.5 billion years ago. This record gives an unambiguous picture of change, starting with the simple and proceeding to the more complex. Although the figure shows the first appearances of groups like reptiles and mammals, this shouldn't be taken to mean that modern forms appear in the fossil record suddenly, arising out of nowhere. Instead, for most groups, we see gradual evolution from earlier forms. Birds and mammals, for example, evolved over millions of years from reptilian ancestors. The existence of gradual transitions between major groups, which I discussed below, means that assigning a date to a first appearance becomes somewhat arbitrary. The first organisms, simple photosynthetic bacteria, appear in sediments about 3.5 billion years old, only about 1 billion years after the planet was formed. These single cells were all that occupied the Earth for the next 2 billion years, after which we see the first simple eukaryotes, organisms having true cells with nuclei and chromosomes. Then, around 600 million years ago, a whole gamut of relatively simple but multicelled organisms arise, including worms, jellyfish, and sponges. These groups diversify over the next several million years, with terrestrial plants and tetrapods, four-legged animals, the earliest of which were lobe-finned fish, appearing about 400 million years ago. Earlier groups, of course, often persisted. Photosynthetic bacteria, sponges, and worms appear in the early fossil record and are still with us. 50 million years later, we find the first true amphibians, and after another 50 million years, reptiles come along. The first mammals show up around 250 million years ago, arising as predicted from reptilian ancestors, and the first birds, also descended from reptiles, show up 50 million years later. After the earliest mammals appear, they, along with insects and land plants, become ever more diverse, and as we approach the shallowest rocks, the fossils increasingly come to resemble living species. Humans are newcomers on the scene. Our lineage branches off from that of other primates only about 7 million years ago, the merest sliver of evolutionary time. Various imaginative analogies have been used to make this point, and it is worth making again. If the entire course of evolution were compressed into a single year, the earliest bacteria would appear at the end of March. But we wouldn't see the first human ancestors until 6 a.m. on December 31st. The Golden Age of Greece, about 500 BC, would occur just 30 seconds before midnight. Although the fossil record of plants is sparser, they lack easily fossilized hard parts. They show a similar evolutionary pattern. The oldest are mosses and algae, followed by the appearance of ferns, then conifers, then deciduous trees, and finally flowering plants. So the appearance of species through time, as seen in fossils, is far from random. Simple organisms evolved before complex ones, predicted ancestors before descendants. The most recent fossils are those most similar to living species, and we have transitional fossils connecting many major groups. No theory of special creation or any theory other than evolution can explain these patterns. Fossilized evolution and speciation. To show gradual evolutionary change within a single lineage, you need a good succession of sediments, preferably laid down quickly, so that each time period represents a thick slice of rock, making change easier to see, and without missing layers. A missing layer in the middle makes a smooth evolutionary transition look like a sudden jump. Very small marine organisms, such as plankton, are ideal for this. There are billions of them, many with hard parts, and they conveniently fall directly to the seafloor after death, piling up in a continuous sequence of layers. Sampling the layers in order is easy. You can thrust a long tube into the seafloor, pull up a columnar core sample, and read it and date it from bottom to top. Tracing a single fossil species through the core, you can often see it evolve. Note, see Figure 4. Figure 4 shows an example of evolution in a tiny, single-celled marine protozoan that builds a spiral shell, creating more chambers as it grows. These samples come from sections of a 200-meter-long core taken from the ocean floor near New Zealand, representing about 8 million years of evolution. The figure shows change over time in one trait, the number of chambers in the final whorl of the shell. Here we see fairly smooth and gradual change over time. Individuals have about 4.8 chambers per whorl at the beginning of the sequence and 3.3 at the end, a decrease of about 30%. Evolution, though gradual, need not always proceed smoothly or at an even pace. Note, see Figure 5. Figure 5 shows a more irregular pattern in another marine microorganism, the radiolarian Pseudocubus vima. In this case, geologists took regularly spaced samples from an 18-meter-long core extracted near Antarctica, representing about 2 million years of sediments. The trait measured was the width of the animal's cylindrical base, its thorax. Although size increases by nearly 50% over time, the trend is not smooth. There are periods in which size doesn't change much, interspersed with periods of more rapid change. This pattern is quite common in fossils and is completely understandable if the changes we see were driven by environmental factors, such as fluctuations in climate or salinity. Environments themselves change sporadically and unevenly, so the strength of natural selection will wax and wane. Let's look at evolution in a more complex species, trilobites. Trilobites were arthropods, in the same group as insects and spiders. Since they were protected by a hard shell, they are extremely common in ancient rocks. You can probably buy one in your nearest museum shop. Peter Sheldon, then at Trinity College, Dublin, collected trilobite fossils from a layer of Welsh shale spanning about 3 million years. Within this rock, he found 8 distinct lineages of trilobites, and over time each showed evolutionary change in the number of pygidial ribs, the segments on the last section of the body. Note, see Figure 6. Figure 6 shows the changes in several of these lineages. Although over the entire period of sampling every species showed a net increase in segment number, the changes among different species were not only uncorrelated, but sometimes went in opposite directions during the same period. Unfortunately, we have no idea what selective pressures drove the evolutionary changes in these plankton and trilobites. It is always easier to document evolution in the fossil record than to understand what caused it, for although fossils are preserved, their environments are not. What we can say is that there was evolution, it was gradual, and it varied in both pace and direction. Marine plankton give evidence for the splitting of lineages as well as evolution within a lineage. Note, see Figure 7. Figure 7 shows an ancestral plankton species dividing into 2 descendants, distinguishable by both size and shape. Interestingly, the new species, Eucertidium matayame, first evolved in an area to the north of the area from where these cores were taken, and only later invaded the area where its ancestors occurred. As we'll see in Chapter 7, the formation of a new species usually begins when populations are geographically isolated from one another. There are hundreds of other examples of evolutionary change in fossils, both gradual and punctuated, from species as diverse as mollusks, rodents, and primates. And there are also examples of species that barely change over time. Remember that evolutionary theory does not state that all species must evolve. But listing these cases wouldn't change my point. The fossil record gives no evidence for the creationist prediction that all species appear suddenly and then remain unchanged. Instead, forms of life appear in the record in evolutionary sequence and then evolve and split. Missing links. Changes in marine species may give evidence for evolution, but that's not the only lesson that the fossil record has to teach. What really excites people, biologists and paleontologists among them, are transitional forms. Those fossils that span the gap between 2 very different kinds of living organisms. Did birds really come from reptiles, land animals from fish, and whales from land animals? If so, where is the fossil evidence? Even some creationists will admit that minor changes in size and shape might occur over time, a process called microevolution. But they reject the idea that one very different kind of animal or plant can come from another, macroevolution. Advocates of intelligent design argue that this kind of difference requires the direct intervention of a creator. Although in the origin, Darwin could point to no transitional forms, he would have been delighted by how his theory has been confirmed by the fruits of modern paleontology. These include numerous species whose existence was predicted many years ago, but that have been unearthed in only the last few decades. But what counts as fossil evidence for a major evolutionary transition? According to evolutionary theory, for every 2 species, however different, there was once a single species that was the ancestor of both. We could call this one species the missing link. As we've seen, the chance of finding that single ancestral species in the fossil record is almost 0. The fossil record is simply too spotty to expect that. But we needn't give up, for we can find some other species in the fossil record, close cousins to the actual missing link, that document common ancestry equally well. Let's take one example. In Darwin's day, biologists conjectured from anatomical evidence, such as similarities in the structure of hearts and skulls, that birds were closely related to reptiles. They speculated that there must have been a common ancestor that, through a speciation event, produced two lineages, one eventually yielding all modern birds and the other all modern reptiles. What would this common ancestor have looked like? Our intuition is to say that it would have resembled something halfway between a modern reptile and a modern bird, showing a mixture of features from both types of animal. But this need not be the case, as Darwin clearly saw in the origin. I have found it difficult, when looking at any two species, to avoid picturing to myself forms directly intermediate between them. But this is a wholly false view. We should always look for forms intermediate between each species and a common but unknown progenitor. And the progenitor will generally have differed in some respects from all of its modified descendants. Because reptiles appear in the fossil record before birds, we can guess that the common ancestor of birds and reptiles was an ancient reptile, and would have looked like one. We now know that this common ancestor was a dinosaur. Its overall appearance would give few clues that it was indeed a missing link, that one lineage of descendants would later give rise to all modern birds and the other to more dinosaurs. Truly bird-like traits, such as wings and a large breastbone for anchoring the flight muscles, would have evolved only later on the branch leading to birds. And as that lineage itself progressed from reptiles to birds, it sprouted off many species having mixtures of reptile-like and bird-like traits. Some of those species went extinct, while others continued evolving into what are now modern birds. It is to these groups of ancient species, the relatives of species near the branch point, that we must look for evidence of common ancestry. Showing common ancestry of two groups, then, does not require that we produce fossils of the precise single species that was their common ancestor, or even species on the direct line of descent from an ancestor to descendant. Rather, we need only produce fossils having the types of traits that link two groups together, and importantly, we must also have the dating evidence showing that those fossils occur at the right time in the geological record. A transitional species is not equivalent to an ancestral species. It is simply a species showing a mixture of traits from organisms that lived both before and after it. Given the patchiness of the fossil record, finding these forms at the proper times in the record is a sound and realistic goal. In the reptile-to-bird transition, for instance, the transitional forms should look like early reptiles, but with some bird-like traits. And we should find these transitional fossils after reptiles had already evolved, but before modern birds appeared. Further, transitional forms don't have to be on the direct line of descent from an ancestor to a living descendant. They could be evolutionary cousins that went extinct. As we'll see, the dinosaurs that gave rise to birds sported feathers, but some feathered dinosaurs continued to persist well after more bird-like creatures had evolved. Those later feathered dinosaurs still provide evidence for evolution because they tell us something about where the birds came from. The dating and, to some extent, the physical appearance of transitional creatures, then, can be predicted from evolutionary theory. Some of the more recent and dramatic predictions that have been fulfilled involve our own group, the vertebrates. On to the land, from fish to amphibians. One of the greatest fulfilled predictions of evolutionary biology is the discovery, in 2004, of a transitional form between fish and amphibians. This is the fossil species, Tiktaalik rosei, which tells us a lot about how vertebrates came to live on the land. Its discovery is a stunning vindication of the theory of evolution. Until about 390 million years ago, The only vertebrates were fish. But 30 million years later, we find creatures that are clearly tetrapods, four-footed vertebrates that walked on land. These early tetrapods were like modern amphibians in several ways. They had flat heads and bodies, a distinct neck, and well-developed legs and limb girdles. Yet they also show strong links with earlier fishes, particularly the group known as lobe-finned fishes, so called because of their large bony fins that enabled them to prop themselves up on the bottom of shallow lakes or streams. The fish-like structures of early tetrapods include scales, limb bones, and head bones. Note, see Figure 8. How did early fish evolve to survive on land? This was the question that interested, or rather obsessed, my University of Chicago colleague, Neil Shubin. Neil had spent years studying the evolution of limbs from fins, and was driven to understand the earliest stages of that evolution. This is where the prediction comes in. If there were lobe-finned fishes but no terrestrial vertebrates 390 million years ago, and clearly terrestrial vertebrates 360 million years ago, where would you expect to find the transitional forms? Somewhere in between. Following this logic, Shubin predicted that if transitional forms existed, their fossils would be found in strata around 375 million years old. Moreover, the rocks would have to be from freshwater rather than marine sediments, because late lobe-finned fish and early amphibians both lived in fresh water. Searching his college geology textbook for a map of exposed freshwater sediments of the right age, Shubin and his colleagues zeroed in on a paleontologically unexplored region of the Canadian Arctic, Ellesmere Island, which sits in the Arctic Ocean north of Canada. And after 5 long years of fruitless and expensive searching, they finally hit pay dirt, a group of fossil skeletons stacked one atop another in sedimentary rock from an ancient stream. When Shubin first saw the fossil face poking out of the rock, he knew that he had at last found his transitional form. In honor of the local Inuit people and the donor who helped fund the expeditions, the fossil was named Tiktaalik rosii. Tiktaalik means large freshwater fish in Inuit, and rosii is a cryptic reference to the anonymous donor. Tiktaalik has features that make it a direct link between the earlier lobe-finned fish and the later amphibians. Figure 8. With gills, scales, and fins, it was clearly a fish that lived its life in water. But it also has amphibian-like features. For one thing, its head is flattened like that of a salamander, with the eyes and nostrils on top rather than on the sides of the skull. This suggests that it lived in shallow water and could peer and probably breathe above the surface. The fins had become more robust, allowing the animal to flex itself upward to help survey its surroundings. And like the earlier amphibians, Tiktaalik has a neck. Fish don't have necks. Their skulls join directly to their shoulders. Most important, Tiktaalik has 2 novel traits that were to prove useful in helping its descendants invade the land. The first is a set of sturdy ribs that help the animal pump air into its lungs and move oxygen from its gills. Tiktaalik could breathe both ways. And instead of the many tiny bones in the fins of lobe-finned fish, Tiktaalik had fewer and sturdier bones in the limbs. Bones similar in number and position to those of every land creature that came later, including ourselves. In fact, its limbs are best described as part fin, part leg. Clearly, Tiktaalik was well adapted to live and crawl about in shallow waters, peek above the surface, and breathe air. Given its structure, we can envision the next critical evolutionary step, which probably involved a novel behavior. A few of Tiktaalik's descendants were bold enough to venture out of the water on their sturdy fin limbs, perhaps to make their way to another stream, as the bizarre mudskipper fish of the tropics does today, to avoid predators, or perhaps to find food among the many giant insects that had already evolved. If there were advantages to venturing onto land, natural selection could mold those explorers from fish into amphibians. That first small step ashore proved a great leap for vertebrate kind, ultimately leading to the evolution of every land-dwelling creature with a backbone. Tiktaalik itself was not ready for life ashore. For one thing, it had not yet evolved a limb that would allow it to walk, and it still had internal gills for breathing underwater. So we can make another prediction. Somewhere, in freshwater sediments about 380 million years old, we'll find a very early land dweller with reduced gills and limbs a bit sturdier than those of Tiktaalik. Tiktaalik shows that our ancestors were flat-headed predatory fish who lurked in the shallow waters of streams. It is a fossil that marvelously connects fish with amphibians, and equally marvelous is that its discovery was not only anticipated but predicted to occur in rocks of a certain age and in a certain place. The best way to experience the drama of evolution is to see the fossils for yourself, or better yet, handle them. My students had this chance when Neil brought a cast of Tiktaalik to class, passed it around, and showed how it filled the bill of a true transitional form. This was to them the most tangible evidence that evolution was true. How often do you get to put your hands on a piece of evolutionary history, much less one that might have been your distant ancestor? Into thin air, the origin of birds. Of what use is half a wing? Ever since Darwin, that question has been raised to cast doubt on evolution and natural selection. Biologists tell us that birds evolved from early reptiles, but how could a land-dwelling animal evolve the ability to fly? Natural selection, creationists argue, could not explain this transition, because it would require intermediate stages in which animals have just the rudiments of a wing. This would seem more likely to encumber a creature than to give it a selective advantage. But if you think a bit, it's not so hard to come up with intermediate stages in the evolution of flight, stages that might have been useful to their possessors. Gliding is the obvious first step, and gliding has evolved independently many times, in placental mammals, marsupials, and even lizards. Flying squirrels do quite well by gliding with flaps of skin that extend along their sides, a good way to get from tree to tree to escape predators or find nuts. And there is the even more remarkable flying lemur or colugo of Southeast Asia, which has an impressive membrane stretching from head to tail. One colugo was seen gliding for a distance of 450 feet, nearly the length of 6 tennis courts, while losing only 40 feet in height. It's not hard to envision the next evolutionary step, the flapping of colugo-like limbs to produce true flight, as we see in bats. But we no longer have to only imagine this step. We now have the fossils that clearly show how flying birds evolved. Since the 19th century, the similarity between the skeletons of birds and some dinosaurs led paleontologists to theorize that they had a common ancestor, in particular the theropods, agile carnivorous dinosaurs that walked on 2 legs. Around 200 million years ago, the fossil record shows plenty of theropods, but nothing that looks even vaguely bird-like. By 70 million years ago, we see fossils of birds that look fairly modern. If evolution is true, then we should expect to see the reptile-bird transition in rocks between 70 and 200 million years old. And there they are. The first link between birds and reptiles was actually known to Darwin, who, curiously, mentioned it only briefly in later editions of The Origin, and then only as an oddity. It is perhaps the most famous of all transitional forms, the crow-sized Archaeopteryx lithographica, discovered in a limestone quarry in Germany in 1860. The name Archaeopteryx means ancient wing, and lithographica comes from the Solnhofen limestone, fine-grained enough to make lithographic plates and preserve the impressions of soft feathers. Archaeopteryx has just the combination of traits one would expect to find in a transitional form, and its age, about 145 million years, places it where we would expect. Archaeopteryx is really more reptile than bird. Its skeleton is almost identical to that of some theropod dinosaurs. In fact, some biologists who didn't look at the Archaeopteryx fossils closely enough missed the feathers and misclassified the beasts as theropods. Figure 9 shows this similarity between the two types. The reptilian features include a jaw with teeth, a long bony tail, claws, separate fingers on the wing. In modern birds, these bones are fused, as you can see by inspecting a gnawed chicken wing, and a neck attached to its skull from behind, as in dinosaurs, instead of from below, as in modern birds. The bird-like traits number just 2, large feathers and an opposable big toe, probably used for perching. It still isn't clear whether this creature, though fully feathered, could fly, but its asymmetrical feathers, one side of each feather is larger than the other, suggests that it could. Asymmetrical feathers, like airplane wings, create the airfoil shape necessary for aerodynamic flight. But even if it could fly, Archaeopteryx is mainly dinosaurian. It is also what evolutionists call a mosaic. Rather than having every feature appear halfway between those of birds and reptiles, Archaeopteryx has a few bits that are very bird-like, while most bits are very reptilian. After the discovery of Archaeopteryx, no other reptile-bird intermediates were found for many years, leaving a gaping hole between modern birds and their ancestors. Then, in the mid-1990s, a spate of astonishing discoveries from China began to fill in the gap. These fossils, found in lake sediments that preserve the impressions of soft parts, represent a veritable parade of feathered theropod dinosaurs. Some of these have very small filamentous structures covering the whole body, probably early feathers. One is the remarkable Sinornithosaurus millenii. Sinornithosaurus means Chinese bird lizard, whose whole body was covered with long, thin feathers. Feathers so small that they couldn't possibly have helped it fly. Note, see Figure 10a. And its claws, teeth, and long bony tail clearly show that this creature was far from being a modern bird. Other dinosaurs show medium-sized feathers on their heads and forelimbs. Still others have large feathers on the forelimbs and tail, much like modern birds. The most striking of all is Microraptor gui, the four-winged dinosaur. Unlike any modern bird, this bizarre 30-inch-long creature had fully feathered arms and legs. Note, see Figure 10b, which when stretched out were probably used for gliding. Theropod dinosaurs didn't just have primitive bird-like features, it seems. They even behaved in bird-like ways. The American paleontologist Mark Norell and his team described 2 fossils showing ancient behavior, and if ever fossils could be called touching, these are they. One is a small feathered dinosaur sleeping with its head tucked under its folded, wing-like forearm, exactly as modern birds sleep. Note, see Figure 11. The animal, given the scientific name Mei Long, Chinese for soundly sleeping dragon, must have died while slumbering. The other fossil is a female theropod who met her end while sitting on her nest of eggs, showing brooding behavior similar to that of birds. All the non-flying feathered dinosaur fossils date between 135 and 110 million years ago, later than the 145 million-year-old Archaeopteryx. That means that they could not be Archaeopteryx's direct ancestors, but they could have been its cousins. Feathered dinosaurs probably continued to exist after one of their kin gave rise to birds. We should then be able to find even older feathered dinosaurs that were the ancestors of Archaeopteryx. The problem is that feathers are preserved only in special sediments, the fine-grained silt of quiet environments like lake beds or lagoons, and these conditions are very rare. But we can make another testable evolutionary prediction. Someday, we'll find fossils of feathered dinosaurs that are older than Archaeopteryx. We're not sure whether Archaeopteryx is the one single species that gave rise to all modern birds. It seems unlikely that it was the missing link. But regardless, it's one of a long string of fossils, some found by the intrepid Paul Sereno, that clearly document the appearance of modern birds. As these fossils get younger, we see the reptilian tail shrinking, the teeth disappearing, the claws fusing together, and the appearance of a large breastbone to anchor the flight muscles. Put together, the fossils show that the basic skeletal plan of birds and those essential feathers evolved before birds could fly. There were many feathered dinosaurs, and their feathers are clearly related to those of modern birds. But if feathers didn't arise as adaptations for flying, what on earth were they for? Again, we don't know. They could have been used for ornamentation or display, perhaps to attract mates. It seems more likely, though, that they were used for insulation. Unlike modern reptiles, theropods may have been partially warm-blooded, and even if they weren't, feathers would have helped maintain body temperature. And what feathers evolved from is even more mysterious. The best guess is that they derive from the same cells that give rise to reptilian scales, but not everyone agrees. Despite the unknowns, we can make some guesses about how natural selection fashioned modern birds. Early carnivorous dinosaurs evolved longer forelimbs and hands, which probably helped them grab and handle their prey. That kind of grabbing would favor the evolution of muscles that would quickly extend the front legs and pull them inward, exactly the motion used for the downward stroke in true flight. Then followed the feathery covering, probably for insulation. Given these innovations, there are at least two ways flight could then have evolved. The first is called the trees-down scenario. There is evidence that some theropods lived at least partly in trees. Feathery forelimbs would help these reptiles glide from tree to tree or from tree to ground, which would help them escape predators, find food more readily, or cushion their falls. A different and more likely scenario is called the ground-up theory, which sees flight evolving as an outgrowth of open-armed runs and leaps that feathered dinosaurs might have made to catch their prey. Longer wings could also have evolved as running aids. The chukar partridge, a game bird studied by Kenneth Dial at the University of Montana, represents a living example of this step. These partridges almost never fly, and flap their wings mainly to help them run uphill. The flapping gives them not only extra propulsion, but also more traction against the ground. Newborn chicks can run up 45-degree slopes. An adult can ascend 105-degree slopes, overhangs more than vertical, solely by running and flapping their wings. The obvious advantage is that uphill scrambling helps these birds escape predators. The next step in evolving flight would be very short airborne hops, like those made by turkeys and quail fleeing from danger. In either the trees-down or ground-up scenario, natural selection could begin to favor individuals who could fly farther instead of merely gliding, leaping, or flying for short bursts. Then would come the other innovations shared by modern birds, including hollow bones for lightness and that large breastbone. While we may speculate about the details, the existence of transitional fossils and the evolution of birds from reptiles is fact. Fossils like Archaeopteryx and its later relatives show a mixture of bird-like and early reptilian traits, and they occur at the right time in the fossil record. Scientists predicted that birds evolved from theropod dinosaurs, and sure enough, we find theropod dinosaurs with feathers. We see a progression in time from early theropods having thin, filamentous body coverings to later ones with distinct feathers, probably adept gliders. What we see in bird evolution is the refashioning of old features, forelimbs with fingers and thin filaments on the skin, into new ones, fingerless wings and feathers, just as evolutionary theory predicts. Back to the water, the evolution of whales. Duane Gish, an American creationist, is renowned for his lively and popular, if wildly misguided, lectures attacking evolution. I once attended one, during which Gish made fun of biologists' theory that whales descended from land animals related to cows. How, he asked, could such a transition occur? since the intermediate form would have been poorly adapted to both land and water, and thus couldn't be built by natural selection. This resembles the half-a-wing argument against the evolution of birds. To illustrate his point, Gish showed a slide of a mermaid-like cartoon animal, whose front half was a spotted cow and whose rear half was a fish. Apparently puzzled over its own evolutionary fate, this clearly maladapted beast was standing at the water's edge, a large question mark hovering over its head. The cartoon had the intended effect. The audience burst into laughter. How stupid, they thought, could evolutionists be? Indeed, a mercow is a ludicrous example of a transitional form between terrestrial and aquatic mammals. An utter failure, as Gish called it. But let's forget the jokes and rhetoric and look to nature. Can we find any mammals that live on both land and water, the kind of creature that supposedly could not have evolved? Easily. A good candidate is the hippopotamus, which, although closely related to terrestrial mammals, is about as aquatic as a land mammal can get. There are two species, the pygmy hippo and the regular hippo, whose scientific name is, appropriately, Hippopotamus amphibius. Hippos spend most of their time submerged in tropical rivers and swamps, surveying their domain with eyes, noses, and ears that sit atop their head, all of which can be tightly closed under water. Hippos mate in the water, and their babies, who can swim before they can walk, are born and suckle underwater. Because they are mostly aquatic, hippos have special adaptations for coming ashore to graze. They usually feed at night, and because they're prone to sunburn, secrete an oily red fluid that contains a pigment, hipposudoric acid, that acts as a sunscreen and possibly an antibiotic. This has given rise to the myth that hippos sweat blood. Hippos are obviously well adapted to their environment, and it's not hard to see that if they could find enough food in the water, they might eventually evolve into totally aquatic, whale-like creatures. But we don't just have to imagine how whales evolved by extrapolating from living species. Whales happen to have an excellent fossil record, courtesy of their aquatic habits and robust, easily fossilized bones. And how they evolved has emerged within only the last 20 years. This is one of our best examples of an evolutionary transition, since we have a chronologically ordered series of fossils, perhaps a lineage of ancestors and descendants showing their movement from land to water. It's been recognized since the 17th century that whales and their relatives, the dolphins and porpoises, are mammals. They are warm-blooded, produce live young whom they feed with milk, and have hair around their blowholes. And evidence from whale DNA, as well as vestigial traits like their rudimentary pelvis and hind legs, show that their ancestors lived on land. Whales almost certainly evolved from a species of artiodactyls, the group of mammals that have an even number of toes, such as camels and pigs. Biologists now believe that the closest living relative of whales is, you guessed it, the hippopotamus. So maybe the hippo-to-whale scenario is not so far-fetched after all. But whales have their own unique features that set them apart from their terrestrial relatives. These include the absence of rear legs, front limbs that are shaped like paddles, a flattened, fluke-like tail, a blowhole, a nostril atop the head, a short neck, simple conical teeth, different from the complex multi-cuspid teeth of land animals, special features of the ear that allow them to hear underwater, and robust projections on top of the vertebrae to anchor the strong swimming muscles of the tail. Thanks to an amazing series of fossil finds in the Middle East, we can trace the evolution of each of these traits, except for the boneless tail, which doesn't fossilize, from a terrestrial to an aquatic form. 60 million years ago, there were plenty of fossil mammals, but no fossil whales. Creatures that resemble modern whales show up 30 million years later. We should be able then to find the transitional forms within this gap. And once again, that's exactly where they are. Figure 12 shows, in chronological order, some of the fossils involved in this transition, spanning the period between 52 and 40 million years ago. There is no need to describe this transition in detail, as the drawings clearly speak, if not shout, of how a land-living animal took to the water. The sequence begins with a recently discovered fossil of a close relative of whales, a raccoon-sized animal called Indohyus. Living 48 million years ago, Indohyus was, as predicted, an artiodactyl. It is clearly closely related to whales because it has special features of the ears and teeth, seen only in modern whales and their aquatic ancestors. Although Indohyus appears slightly later than the largely aquatic ancestors of whales, it is probably very close to what the whale ancestor looked like. And it was at least partially aquatic. We know this because its bones were denser than those of fully terrestrial mammals, which kept the creature from bobbing about in the water, and because the isotopes extracted from its teeth show that it absorbed a lot of oxygen from water. It probably waded in shallow streams or lakes to graze on vegetation or escape from its enemies, much like a similar animal, the African water chevrotain, does today. This part-time life in water probably put the ancestor of whales on the road to becoming fully aquatic. Indohyus was not the ancestor of whales, but was almost certainly its cousin. But if we go back 4 million more years, to 52 million years ago, we see what might well be that ancestor. It is a fossil skull from a wolf-sized creature called Pakicetus, which is a bit more whale-like than Indohyus, having simpler teeth and whale-like ears. Pakicetus still looked nothing like a modern whale, so if you had been around to see it, you wouldn't have guessed that it or its close relatives would give rise to a dramatic evolutionary radiation. Then follows, in rapid order, a series of fossils that become more and more aquatic with time. At 50 million years ago, there is the remarkable Ambulocetus, literally walking whale, with an elongated skull and reduced but still robust limbs that still ended in hooves that reveal its ancestry. It probably spent most of its time in shallow water and would have waddled awkwardly on land, much like a seal. Rhodocetus, 47 million years ago, is even more aquatic. Its nostrils have moved somewhat backward, and it has a more elongated skull. With stout extensions on the backbone to anchor its tail muscles, Rhodocetus must have been a good swimmer, but was handicapped on land by its small pelvis and hind limbs. The creature certainly spent most, if not all, of its time at sea. Finally, at 40 million years ago, we find the fossils Basilosaurus and Dorudon, clearly fully aquatic mammals with short necks and blowholes atop the skull. They could not have spent any time on land, for their pelvis and hind limbs were reduced. The 50-foot Dorudon had legs only 2 feet long, and were unconnected to the rest of the skeleton. The evolution of whales from land animals was remarkably fast. Most of the action took place within only 10 million years. That's not much longer than the time it took us to diverge from our common ancestor with chimpanzees, a transition that involved far less modification of the body. Still, adapting to life at sea did not require the evolution of any brand new features, only modifications of old ones. But why did some animals go back to the water at all? After all, millions of years earlier, their ancestors had invaded the land. We're not sure why there was a reverse migration, but there are several ideas. One possibility involves the disappearance of the dinosaurs, along with their fierce marine cousins, the fish-eating mosasaurs, ichthyosaurs, and plesiosaurs. These creatures would not only have competed with aquatic mammals for food, but probably made a meal of them. With their reptilian competitors extinct, the ancestors of whales may have found an open niche, free from predators and loaded with food. The sea was ripe for invasion. All of its benefits were only a few mutations away. What the fossils say. If at this point you're feeling overwhelmed with fossils, be consoled that I've omitted hundreds of others that also show evolution. There is the transition between reptiles and mammals, so amply documented with intermediate mammal-like reptiles that they are the subjects of many books. Then there are the horses, a branching evolutionary bush leading from a small, five-toed ancestor to the proud hoofed species of today. And of course there is the human fossil record, described in Chapter 8, surely the best example of an evolutionary prediction fulfilled. At the risk of overkill, I'll briefly mention a few more important transitional forms. The first is an insect. From anatomical similarities, entomologists had long supposed that ants evolved from non-social wasps. In 1967, E.O. Wilson and his colleagues found a transitional ant, preserved in amber, bearing almost exactly the combination of ant-like and wasp-like features that entomologists had predicted. Note, see Figure 13. Similarly, snakes have long been supposed to have evolved from lizard-like reptiles that lost their legs, since reptiles with legs appear in the fossil record well before snakes. In 2006, paleontologists digging in Patagonia found a fossil of the earliest known snake, 90 million years old. Just as predicted, it had a small pelvic girdle and reduced hind legs. And perhaps the most thrilling find of all is a 530 million year old fossil from China called Haikuella lanceolata, resembling a small eel with a frilly dorsal fin. But it also had a head, a brain, a heart, and a cartilaginous bar along the back, the notochord. This marks it as perhaps the earliest chordate, the group that gave rise to all vertebrates, including ourselves. In this complex, inch-long creature may lie the roots of our own evolution. The fossil record teaches us three things. First, it speaks loudly and eloquently of evolution. The record in the rocks confirms several predictions of evolutionary theory: gradual change within lineages, splitting of lineages, and the existence of transitional forms between very different kinds of organisms. There is no getting around this evidence, no waving it away. Evolution happened, and in many cases we see how. Second, when we find transitional forms, they occur in the fossil record precisely where they should. The earliest birds appear after dinosaurs, but before modern birds. We see ancestral whales spanning the gap between their own landlubber ancestors and fully modern whales. If evolution were not true, fossils would not occur in an order that makes evolutionary sense. Asked what observation could conceivably disprove evolution, the curmudgeonly biologist J.B.S. Haldane reportedly growled, "Fossil rabbits in the Precambrian." That's the geological period that ended 543 million years ago. Needless to say, no Precambrian rabbits or any other anachronistic fossils have ever been found. Finally, evolutionary change, even of a major sort, nearly always involves remodeling the old into the new. The legs of land animals or variations on the stout limbs of ancestral fish. The tiny middle ear bones of mammals are remodeled jawbones of their reptilian ancestors. The wings of birds were fashioned from the legs of dinosaurs, and whales are stretched-out land animals whose four limbs have become paddles and whose nostrils have moved atop their head. There is no reason why a celestial designer, fashioning organisms from scratch like an architect designs buildings, should make new species by remodeling the features of existing ones. Each species could be constructed from the ground up, but natural selection can only act by changing what already exists. It can't produce new traits out of thin air. Darwinism predicts, then, that new species will be modified versions of older ones. The fossil record amply confirms this prediction.